I learned that my father was dead from a stranger's Facebook message, and by the time I saw it, they had already lowered him into the ground. I was sitting in the break room at Station 14, halfway through a lukewarm coffee, when my phone buzzed with a notification from a name I hadn't seen in almost a decade. Carol Ann Whitfield. She used to sing in the choir with my mother. I almost swiped it away without reading it. Then I saw the attachment. A screenshot. A funeral program, cream-colored, bordered in gold. A photograph of my father in his gray Sunday suit, the one he wore to church for 30 years, smiling the careful, closed-mouth smile he always gave for cameras. Above his picture, in elegant script, were the words that stopped my heart mid-beat. In loving memory of Thomas Edward Mercer. Underneath, a date that told me the funeral had happened 6 hours earlier. I read it 3 times before my brain would accept what my eyes were telling it. Then I scrolled down, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Hundreds of comments. Neighbors, cousins, people from the hardware store he used to manage. Men he'd coached in Little League 20 years ago. All of them writing about what a gentle soul he was, how peacefully he'd gone, how beautiful the service had been. Not one of them mentioned me, because none of them expected me to be there. Because, as far as this small, tightly knit world was concerned, I didn't exist anymore. I called the nursing home first, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice. A receptionist I didn't recognize confirmed it in a flat, apologetic voice. Yes, Mr. Mercer had passed 6 days earlier. Yes, the family had been notified immediately. She was sorry, she said. She'd assumed I already knew. 6 days. Not 6 hours. 6 days and a funeral already finished. And not one phone call. Not one text. Not one voicemail from the family that shared my last name. I stood in that break room with the phone against my ear long after the receptionist had said goodbye, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very cold. The way the world sounds right before a storm breaks. Because I already knew, with a certainty that scared me, that this hadn't been an accident. Somebody had made a decision. Somebody had looked at the list of people who deserved to say goodbye to Thomas Mercer, and somebody had crossed my name off it. I just didn't yet know how far back that decision went, or how much my mother had been planning for this exact moment for years. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 35 years old. I've been a paramedic for 11 years, and until that Tuesday afternoon in the break room, I thought I had already survived the worst thing my family could do to me. I was wrong, but to understand how wrong, you have to understand what came before. I grew up in a house that looked, from the outside, like the kind of home people envied. My mother, Evelyn Mercer, sang solos at First Baptist. She organized the church bake sales, chaired the neighborhood watch committee, and could make any stranger feel like the most important person in the room within 30 seconds of meeting her. People loved her. People still love her. They never saw what happened after the front door closed. My mother did not raise her voice. That was never her weapon. Her weapon was quieter and far more effective. It was the sigh she'd let out when I brought home a B+ instead of an A. It was the way she'd tell relatives, in front of me, "Daniel's always been the sensitive one," in a tone that made sensitivity sound like a defect. It was the careful, surgical way she compared me to my younger brother, Adam, who could do no wrong in her eyes, who got the new bike while I got Adam's old one and was told to be grateful. Kindness was her sharpest tool, not her softest one. The week after she'd tell relatives I was too sensitive, she'd show up at my apartment with a casserole and a hug that lasted a beat too long, telling everyone afterward how she'd checked in on Daniel, poor thing, he's been so distant lately. The generosity was real enough that you couldn't call it cruelty without sounding ungrateful, and that was exactly the point. It bought her the right to be hurt when I eventually pulled away, and it let her tell the story of our estrangement in a way that made her the wounded party every single time. My father, Thomas, was a good man buried under a compliant one. He worked long hours at the hardware store he managed, came home tired, and rarely intervened when my mother's comments cut close to the bone. I don't think he was cruel. I think he was exhausted, and exhausted men choose peace over principle more often than they'd like to admit. There were nights I'd catch him looking at me with something like guilt in his eyes, like he wanted to say something and never found the courage. But he had his own quiet language of love. When I was 10, my bike chain snapped, and I found him in the garage after dinner, kneeling over it under the hanging bulb, grease on his knuckles, humming off-key. He didn't say much. He never did. But he tightened that chain like it mattered, like I mattered. And when he looked up, he said, "There you go, bud. Good as new." It's a small thing to remember. It's also one of the only times in my childhood I felt like I didn't have to earn anything at all. I left for community college at 18 and never really came back, not fully. I built a career, met a woman named Emma who made me feel, for the first time in my life, like I didn't have to earn love through performance. We got married. We had a daughter, Lily, who is 9 years old now and has never once heard her grandmother raise her voice at her, because I made sure of it. 7 years ago, I stopped visiting. It happened after a Thanksgiving dinner where my mother spent 45 minutes recounting, to a table full of relatives, a humiliating story from my childhood, a bedwetting incident from when I was 6, dressed up as an amusing anecdote, delivered with a smile, landing like a slap every single time she told it over the years. Emma finally spoke up. My mother turned to her and said, sweetly, "Oh, Daniel's always been overly sensitive about the little things." The room laughed. I didn't. I drove home that night in silence, and somewhere on that dark highway, something in me finally broke loose. I decided I was done being the family's cautionary tale, done being managed and mocked in the same breath. I called my mother the next week and told her I needed distance. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply told her that until things changed, I would be stepping back. She told me I was breaking her heart. She told me I was punishing her for loving me too much. She told Adam and half the extended family that I had abandoned them without explanation, that grief and stress had made me cruel and unstable. Within a month, cousins who'd known me my whole life stopped returning my calls. Only my father kept calling. Quietly, always when my mother wasn't home, always brief, always ending the same way. "I love you, son. Take care of your family." I clung to those calls like a lifeline for 2 years. The last time I saw him healthy, we met for lunch at a diner off Route 9. Just the two of us. Something we'd started doing quietly after I went low contact, always without my mother's knowledge. He was unusually quiet that afternoon, turning his coffee cup in slow circles instead of drinking it. Near the end he said, "Your mother means well, you know? She just shows it strangely." I didn't answer right away, and something in my silence must have reached him, because he set the cup down and added, so quietly I almost missed it, "I know that's not really true. I've known for a long time. I just don't know how to say it out loud yet." He never got the chance to finish that thought before his hands started shaking 3 months later, and I've replayed that unfinished sentence more times than I can count. Parkinson's, the doctor said, and within 18 months, he needed more care than my mother could give him at home. She moved him into Willowbrook Manor, a nursing facility 40 minutes outside of town, and something in our already thin connection frayed further. The calls slowed. Then they stopped almost entirely. When I tried calling the facility directly for updates, I was told, apologetically, that I wasn't listed as an authorized contact. I remember asking the nurse, who removed me. She wasn't allowed to say, but I already knew. Emma watched me carry that grief for 2 years, watched me come home from 12-hour shifts and sit in the driveway a few extra minutes before coming inside. Like I needed to leave some invisible weight in the truck before I could be present for her and Lily. She never once told me to just call my mother and smooth things over. She understood that peace bought at the cost of your own dignity isn't peace at all. "You don't owe her access to you," she told me once. On a night, I'd spent an hour staring at my father's contact photo, debating whether to call the house line even though I knew who'd answer. "You can love your dad and still protect yourself from the person standing between you. Those aren't contradictions." I held on to that sentence more than I ever told her, especially on the night some old, well-worn groove in my brain whispered that I was the ungrateful son, the problem the whole family had quietly agreed I was. Emma never let that voice win for long. Neither, in his own limited way, had my father, right up until the very end. I thought losing my father's phone calls was the cruelest thing my mother would ever do to me. I had no idea what she was still capable of. Emma found me still sitting in my truck outside the station 40 minutes after my shift had technically ended, staring at nothing, the Facebook screenshot still glowing on my phone in my lap. I don't remember calling her. I don't remember much of that drive home except her voice on speakerphone, calm and steady, telling me to pull over if I needed to, that she was already getting Lily to her mother's house, that she'd meet me at Willowbrook. They buried him without me, I said, and saying it out loud for the first time nearly broke me in half. We're going to find out why, Emma said, but not tonight in a parking lot. Come home first. I didn't go home. I drove straight to Willowbrook Manor, 40 minutes of highway I don't remember taking, my knuckles white on the wheel, replaying every phone call I'd made over the past 2 years, every time I'd been told I wasn't authorized, every time I'd assumed it was simply hospital policy and not something engineered specifically to keep me out. The woman at the front desk of Willowbrook was new, young, apologetic in the tired way people get when they work in a building full of grief. When I told her my name and asked to speak to someone about my father's final days, her expression shifted from polite confusion to something more guarded. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't release information about a resident to someone who isn't on file as an authorized contact. I'd need administrator approval, and she's not in until Monday. My father is dead, I said. I'm his son. I'm not asking for his medication list. I'm asking why nobody called me. She hesitated, glancing toward the staff hallway. Let me see if Grace is still here. Off the record, she'd probably want to know you came. It wasn't protocol. It was a favor, and I understood I was going to spend the next several weeks depending on people willing to bend rules they had every right to hide behind. Grace Holloway came out still in her scrubs, looking like a woman with nothing left to give a stranger, until she saw my face and something in her shifted. She led me into a small consultation room and sat across from me, hands folded. Mr. Mercer, she finally said, I want to help you, but I need you to understand I could lose my license for some of what I know. I need a minute before I decide how much I'm willing to risk. She exhaled like she'd already made the decision. Start with why nobody told me my father died, I said. Your mother submitted paperwork 2 years ago listing herself as your father's sole contact and decision maker. That's not unusual for spouses. What was unusual, she said, was how specific the instructions were about you. My chest tightened. What instructions? You were explicitly listed as someone not to be contacted under any circumstances, including medical emergencies. She told administration you two had a restraining order situation, that you'd been violent with your father in the past and weren't to be allowed on the premises. I sat there in that small beige room and felt the floor tilt beneath me. I had never once raised a hand to my father in my life. I had never even raised my voice at him. That's not true, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. None of that happened. I believed you the moment I met you tonight, Grace said gently. But I need you to understand something else, because it's the part that's been eating at me for weeks. Your father didn't believe the restraining order story either. He knew exactly what she'd done, and he tried more than once to reach you anyway. I sat with that, some old, exhausted part of me wanting the version where I'd misread everything. 7 years of being told I was too sensitive doesn't disappear because a kind nurse tells you what you want to hear. Grace seemed to see the doubt on my face. She simply stood and asked me to wait. I thought the lie about the restraining order was the worst thing I'd hear that night. I was wrong. What Grace told me next would unravel everything I thought I understood about my father's final months. Grace came back with a small locked box, not the folder I expected. These aren't facility property, she said, almost to herself. I kept them in my own car, honestly, because I didn't trust where else to put them. She unlocked it and pulled out a manila folder, worn soft at the corners. I probably shouldn't be doing this, but your father asked me to keep these safe, and I think he'd want you to have them now. Inside were 4 handwritten letters, addressed to me, my name written in my father's increasingly unsteady hand, the tremor visible in every looping letter. None had stamps. None had ever been mailed. Part of me wondered whether I was about to read what I wanted into a dying man's confusion rather than what he meant. That doubt didn't survive the first paragraph. He wrote them and gave them to your mother to send, Grace said. At least the first 2. When he realized they were never reaching you, he started giving them to me instead, hoping I could find another way. I tried to look up an address for you through the facility system, but I wasn't authorized to release information to non-listed contacts. I'm sorry. I should have found another way. I opened the first letter with hands that weren't entirely steady. It was dated over a year earlier. Daniel, it began. I don't know if these words will ever reach you, but I need to write them down so I know I tried. I should have protected you when you were young. I saw what your mother did, and I told myself keeping the peace mattered more than the truth. I was wrong. I've been wrong for 30 years, and I don't have 30 more to fix it. I love you. I love Emma and that beautiful girl of yours I've only seen in photographs your Aunt Carol showed me in secret. I am so sorry, son. I am so sorry. I read all 4 letters in that small consultation room while Grace sat quietly across from me. And by the time I finished the last one, I understood something that broke and rebuilt me in the same breath. My father had not abandoned me in his final years. He had been fighting, in the only quiet, exhausted way he knew how, to reach me the entire time, and every single attempt had been intercepted. There's something else, Grace said, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice, like she was about to hand me a weight she wasn't sure I could carry. About 3 weeks before he passed, your father asked me to help him make a phone call. Not to your mother, to an attorney, Michael Bennett, downtown. He made me promise not to tell your mother about it. Why would my father need an attorney? Grace met my eyes, and for the first time that night, I saw something like anger flicker behind her calm composure. Because he told me he wanted to change some things before it was too late. He said, and I remember this exactly because it startled me, he said, I need to make sure Daniel isn't erased twice. I didn't understand what that phrase meant that night. I would understand it fully 3 days later, sitting across from Michael Bennett in an office downtown, staring at a document that would change everything I thought I knew about my father's final wishes. Michael Bennett's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, the kind of place that had clearly seen 1,000 grieving families sit in the same worn leather chairs I now occupied with Emma beside me. Bennett was a careful man, methodical in the way he spoke, the kind of attorney who chose every word like he was laying bricks. He didn't open with the folder. He opened with my driver's license, my father's death certificate, and questions about my relationship to Thomas I hadn't anticipated. He was building a record that couldn't later be picked apart, and some part of me was grateful even as it tested my patience. Emma finally moved things forward. Mr. Bennett, I think what my husband is asking is whether you can confirm, right now, that this document exists and names him. Everything else can wait until you're satisfied he is who he says he is. Bennett looked at her, something like respect crossing his face. That I can confirm. Give me until tomorrow to finish verifying the rest, and I'll walk you through everything. I've been expecting you, he said, when we returned the next morning, sliding a folder across the desk. Your father came to me 11 weeks before he passed. He was lucid, competent, and very clear about what he wanted. I want to say that plainly, because I suspect there will be people who try to claim otherwise. The folder contained a revised will, notarized, dated, unmistakably legitimate. In it, my father had done 3 things. He'd named me, not my mother, as executor of a small trust fund he'd quietly built over the years from savings my mother apparently never knew existed. He'd left instructions for his funeral, specific instructions, a particular hymn, a passage he wanted read, and a request that Daniel Mercer be given the opportunity to speak. And he'd attached a signed witness statement. I asked Bennett to explain that last one before I read it myself. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me needed to hear it in someone else's voice first, like a buffer between the words and my heart. Your father wanted it on record, Bennett said carefully, that any claims regarding a restraining order or history of violence between you and him were, in his words, a complete fabrication created by my wife to control access to me and punish my son. He asked me to have it notarized specifically so it would hold up if anyone ever tried to contest it. I sat in that chair and felt 11 years of paramedic training keeping my hands steady while everything else in me came undone. My father had known. He had known exactly what my mother was doing, not just to keep him from me, but to poison my name in the process, to make sure that even if the truth ever surfaced, there'd be a story ready to discredit me. And in his last months, shaking, dying, unable to lift a phone without help, he had found a way to fight back for me anyway. "There's one more thing," Bennett said, and something in his tone made Emma reach for my hand. "Your father specifically requested that this statement, along with a letter he wrote you, be read aloud publicly. At the funeral that had already happened, 6 days ago, without me, without a single word of any of this being spoken. He wanted me there," I said, "and it wasn't a question." "He insisted on it," Bennett said. "Mr. Mercer, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Your father did not simply want you informed of his death. He built a legal safeguard specifically because he suspected, correctly it turns out, that his wife would try to keep you away even then. I thought I understood the full scope of my mother's cruelty. I was about to learn it went deeper than even my father had feared, and the person who would finally break the silence was the last person I expected. Adam called me that night for the first time in 7 years. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the screen for 3 full rings while Emma watched me from across the kitchen. Lily's homework spread between us on the table like the last normal thing in a world that had stopped making sense. I picked up on the 4th ring. Aunt Carol must have finally given him my number, because I knew there was no other way he could have reached me after 7 years. "Danny." His voice cracked on my name, the childhood nickname neither of us had used since we were teenagers. "I need to talk to you, not on the phone. Can I come over?" He showed up 40 minutes later looking like a man who hadn't slept. His eyes red-rimmed, a folder clutched against his chest like it was the only solid thing in the room. Emma took Lily upstairs. Adam sat across from me at the same kitchen table, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "I believed her," he finally said. "For 7 years, I believed every word Mom said about you, that you'd cut us off out of nowhere, that you were unstable, that you'd threatened Dad. I believed it because it never occurred to me that our mother could lie that completely, that consistently, for that long." "What changed?" Adam was quiet for a second. "Honestly, it didn't happen all at once. 2 days before the funeral, one of Dad's old coworkers asked where you were. I gave him the line I'd always given people, that you two didn't get along. He said, 'Your dad talked about Daniel every time I saw him. Didn't sound like a man threatened by his own son.' I told myself he just didn't understand our family. I defended her, Danny, right up until the funeral itself." "Dad's funeral," he continued, and his voice broke fully this time. "I gave the eulogy, Danny. I stood up in front of 200 people and talked about what a peaceful, connected family we were. And the whole time I kept looking at the empty chair where you should have been sitting and something felt wrong. I asked Mom right after why you weren't there. Just came out and asked her. In the church parking lot. What did she say?" Adam opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a printed text message thread, screenshotted and saved. "She told me you'd been notified and chose not to come. Said you were too bitter to show up for your own father's funeral." I believed her, Danny, until I found this on her phone by accident 3 days ago, when I was helping her sort through Dad's belongings. I looked down at the screenshot. It was a text thread between my mother and my Aunt Carol, dated the day my father died. "Evelyn, do not let anyone tell Daniel until after the service. I mean it, Carol. Not one word. Carol, Evelyn, that doesn't feel right. He's still Thomas's son. Evelyn, he stopped being part of this family the day he chose that wife of his over me. He doesn't get to show up now for sympathy points. This is my decision and I need you to respect it." I read it twice, then a third time, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 7 years finally, quietly broke apart. Not from surprise, from confirmation. I had spent 7 years wondering if I'd overreacted, if I'd been too harsh, if maybe my mother's version of events held some grain of truth I'd been too hurt to see. That single text thread erased every trace of doubt I had left. "I'm so sorry," Adam said, and he was crying openly now, the golden child finally cracking under the weight of a truth he'd been protected from his entire life. "I let her turn me against you. I let her turn everyone against you. And the whole time, you were the one who was right. After Adam left, I lay awake longer than I want to admit. Bennett had the will. Adam had the texts. Grace had the letters. And still, some old, familiar voice asked what it had been asking me for 7 years. What if a room full of people who'd known my mother for decades simply chose, the way they always had, to believe her anyway? I thought Adam's confession was the end of the unraveling. It was only the beginning of what would happen 3 days later, when the entire family gathered for what my mother believed would be a simple reading of the will. Michael Bennett's conference room was full by the time Emma and I walked in. My mother seated at the head of the table in a black dress that looked freshly pressed, her posture immaculate, the picture of dignified grief she had clearly rehearsed for this exact moment. Relatives lined the walls. Aunt Carol sat near the back, unable to meet my eyes. Adam sat beside me, which I noticed my mother clocked immediately, her composure flickering for just a fraction of a second before resetting. "Daniel," she said, her voice syrup-smooth, carrying easily across the room. "I'm so glad you decided to finally show your face. I know grief affects people in strange ways. It was, I realized, a small piece of engineering, nothing anyone could quote back to her, just enough to plant the idea that whatever I'd been doing was grief-addled instability rather than a search for the truth. She never needed to attack you directly when she could make the room feel sorry for you instead." I didn't respond. I'd promised myself, driving over, that I wouldn't give her the reaction she was fishing for. Bennett began methodically, reading through the standard provisions first: the house, a modest life insurance policy, small personal items distributed among relatives. My mother's expression stayed pleasant, expectant, the woman used to being the center of every room's attention. Then Bennett reached the section regarding the trust fund, and I watched her face change in real time as she heard, for the first time, that my father had named me as executor. "That's not possible," she said, her voice sharpening for the first time. "Thomas would never." "Mrs. Mercer," Bennett said calmly, "your husband executed this document 11 weeks before his passing. He was assessed as fully competent by 2 independent physicians at the time. I have their evaluations on file if you'd like to review them. He was ill. He was confused. This is clearly the result of manipulation. There's one more document I need to read into the record," Bennett said, and something in his tone made the room go completely still. "A notarized statement your husband asked me to preserve and to share publicly, specifically at his funeral, though circumstances prevented that from happening as he intended." I watched my mother's face while Bennett read my father's words aloud. The room heard, in my father's own carefully chosen language, that the restraining order was fabricated, that he had tried repeatedly to contact his son and been blocked, that he wanted, more than anything in his final months, for the truth to reach the people he loved before he ran out of time to tell it himself. Nobody moved. I remember that most clearly, the stillness of a room watching the ground shift under a version of my mother they'd never questioned. Mrs. Halloran, who'd sung beside her in the choir for 2 decades, pressed a hand flat against her chest. Aunt Carol's eyes stayed fixed on the table, shoulders curled inward. By the time Bennett finished reading, my mother's face had gone the color of old paper. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again, and for the first time in my life, I watched her sit in a room full of people with nothing ready to say. Aunt Carol was the one who finally broke the silence. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "show them the other letters." My mother's head snapped toward her aunt so fast I thought her neck might crack. "Carol, I kept copies," Carol said, and her voice, though shaking, didn't waver. "You made me hide the ones Thomas wrote, but I couldn't bring myself to burn them like you asked. I made copies before I gave them back. I've had them in my closet for over a year, hating myself for staying quiet. I'm not staying quiet anymore." 2 more letters emerged that afternoon, letters my mother had physically confiscated and never delivered, letters in which my father begged, in increasingly desperate language as his illness progressed, for someone, anyone, to bring his son to see him one more time before it was too late. Adam read the last one aloud, his voice unraveling, because Bennett asked and nobody else could bring themselves to volunteer. When he finished, he set the page down carefully, like it might break, and looked at our mother with an expression I'd never seen on him before, closer to grief than anger. My mother tried twice to speak. The first time it came out as a fragment, "I only wanted," before she stopped herself. The second time she reached for Adam's arm and he quietly moved it out of reach. Mrs. Halloran stood and walked out, 2 more relatives following within the minute. My mother watched each departure like she was counting something, and I understood, finally, that what frightened her most in that room wasn't me. It was the image she'd spent 30 years constructing quietly ceasing to be real to anyone in it. I thought watching my mother's carefully built world collapse would feel like victory. What I felt instead surprised everyone in that room, myself most of all. I didn't yell. I didn't stand up and deliver the speech I'd silently composed on countless sleepless nights over the past week. The one where I finally told my mother exactly what 35 years of her cruelty had cost me. I found, sitting in that conference room watching her unravel in real time, that I didn't need to. I stood up slowly, and the room, for once, gave me its full attention. "I'm not going to fight about the trust," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Dad wanted me to have it, and I'll honor what he wanted, every part of it, including making sure Adam and the family are taken care of the way he intended. That's not in question." My mother looked up at me, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been hope, might have been calculation. I genuinely couldn't tell anymore and realized I no longer needed to know. "Daniel, sweetheart?" She started softer now, the tone she used when a punishment needed to look like tenderness. "We can talk about this privately. There's no version of this that stays private anymore, Mom," I said. "You made sure of that yourself, long before I walked into this room. But I need you to understand something," I continued. "I'm not here for an apology. I stopped expecting one from you a long time ago, and honestly, I don't think you're capable of giving one that isn't really about protecting yourself. What I came here for was the truth, and now everyone in this room has it. That's enough for me." "Daniel," she started, and for the first time in my life, I heard something almost like fear in her voice. "I'm not going to scream at you," I said. "I'm not going to spend one more year of my life trying to make you see me as someone worth loving without conditions. My father spent his final months fighting to reach me because some part of him understood, maybe too late, that love isn't supposed to require this much proof. I'm not going to make my daughter grow up watching me chase something that was never going to be given freely." I looked at Adam, who nodded at me through tears, an understanding passing between us that didn't need words. I looked at Aunt Carol and mouthed a silent thank you, and then I looked at my mother one final time. "Goodbye, Mom," I said. "I mean that gently, and I mean it completely." I walked out of that conference room with Emma's hand in mine, and I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood that looking back had never once brought me anything but pain. 3 weeks later, we held a second service for my father, small, quiet, exactly what he'd asked Bennett to arrange in his final instructions. Just the people who actually loved him. Grace Holloway came and cried harder than almost anyone else in the room, which told me everything about the kind of care she'd given him in his final months. Adam stood beside me, and this time, when he spoke, he told the truth, the whole truth, about the father he was only now beginning to understand. I read the hymn my father had requested. I read the passage he'd chosen, about a house built on solid ground weathering the storm while one built on sand collapses. And then, holding the last letter he'd ever written, the one Grace had saved for exactly this moment, I told 200 fewer people than his first funeral, but every single one of them people who genuinely mourned him, who my father really was underneath 30 years of quiet compliance and one final act of courage that arrived, painfully, right at the very end. Lily held my hand through the whole service. She was too young to understand everything that had happened, but old enough to understand that her father was sad, and that it was okay to be sad, and that afterward we would go home together, all 3 of us, to a house where nobody's love came with conditions. That evening, Emma found me sitting on our back porch, watching the sun go down over a yard where Lily's swing set stood, still and quiet in the fading light. She sat beside me without a word, the way she always knew how to do exactly when I needed silence and exactly when I needed her voice. "You okay?" she finally asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered, the way I'd learned to over the past 3 weeks of unraveling nearly everything I thought I understood about my family. I think I finally understand something my dad tried to tell me in that first letter, I said. He said he wished he'd protected me sooner. For years I thought that meant I'd lost something I could never get back. But I think what he was really trying to say was that it's never too late to choose the people who choose you back. Do you forgive her? Emma asked, not pushing, just asking. I don't know yet. Maybe forgiveness isn't the word for what I'm trying to get to. I just want to stop needing anything from her at all. Some days that feels like the same thing. That's allowed, Emma said. You don't owe anyone a timeline on that. I keep thinking about Lily, what she'll remember 20 years from now. I don't want it to be my mother. I want it to be nights like this. Love that never came with conditions. Then that's the only thing you have to get right, Emma said. Everything else you figure out as you go. Emma took my hand, and somewhere behind us, through the kitchen window, I could hear Lily laughing at something on television, safe and unafraid in a home built on something sturdier than blood. I lost my father to a lie, and I lost my mother to a truth she could never bring herself to tell. But sitting on that porch, I understood, finally and completely, that I hadn't lost a family at all. I had simply, at long last, found mine.